Chapter 68. Frank. Frank didn't even notice that he was glowing. Later, Jason told him that the blessing of Mars had shrouded him in red light, like it had in Venice. Javelins couldn't touch him. Rocks somehow got deflected. Even with an arrow sticking out of his left bicep, Frank had never felt so full of energy. The first Cyclops he met went down so quickly it was almost a joke. Frank sliced him in half from shoulder to waist. The big guy exploded into dust. The next Cyclops backed up nervously, so Frank cut his legs out from under him and sent him into the pit. The remaining monsters on their side of the chasm tried to retreat, but the Legion cut them down. "Tatsubo formation!" Frank shouted. "Single file! Advance!" Frank was the first one across the bridge. The dead followed, their shields locked on either side and over their heads, deflecting all attacks. As the last of the zombies crossed, the stone bridge crumbled into the darkness, but by then it didn't matter. Nico kept summoning more legionnaires to join the fight. Over the history of the temple, thousands of Romans had served and died in Greece. Now they were back, answering the call of Diocletian's scepter. Frank waded forward, destroying everything in his path. "I will burn you!" A Telekine squeaked, desperately waving a vial of Greek fire. "I fire!" Frank took him down. As the vial of fire dropped towards the ground, Frank kicked it over the cliff before it could explode. An Impusa raked her claws across Frank's chest, but Frank felt nothing. He sliced the demon into dust and kept moving. Pain was unimportant. Failure was unthinkable. He was a leader of the Legion now, doing what he was born to do, fighting the enemies of Rome, upholding his legacy, and protecting the lives of his friends and his comrades. He was Praetor Frank Zhang. His forces swept the enemy away, breaking their every attempt to regroup. Jason and Piper fought at his side, yelling defiantly. Nico waded through the last group of the Earthborn, slashing them into mounds of wet clay with his black Stygian sword. Before Frank knew it, the battle was over. Piper chopped through the last of the Impusa, who vaporized with an anguished wail. "Frank," Jason said, "you're on fire." He looked down. A few drops of the oil must have splattered on his pants, because they were starting to smolder. Frank batted at them until they stopped smoking, but he wasn't particularly worried. Thanks to Leo, he no longer had to fear fire. Nico cleared his throat. You have an arrow sticking through your arm." "I know." Frank snapped the point of the arrow and pulled it out by the shaft. He felt only a warm tugging sensation. "I'll be fine." Piper made him eat a piece of ambrosia. As she bandaged his wound, she said, "Frank, you were amazing. Completely terrifying, but amazing." Frank had trouble processing her words. Terrifying could not apply to him. He was just Frank. His adrenaline drained away. He looked around him, wondering where all the enemies had gone. The only monsters left were his own Roman undead, standing in stupor with their weapons lowered. Nico held up his scepter, its orb dark and dormant. "The dead won't stay much longer now that the battle is over." Frank faced his troops. "Legion!" The zombie soldiers snapped to attention. "You fought well," Frank told them. "Now you may rest. Dismissed!" They crumbled into piles of bones, armor, shields, and weapons. Then, even though it was disintegrated, Frank felt that he might crumble too. Despite the ambrosia, his wounded arm began to throb. His eyes were heavy with exhaustion. The blessing of Mars faded, leaving him depleted. But his work was not done yet. "Hazel, Leo," he said. "We need to find them." His friends peered across the chasm. At the other end of the cavern, the tunnel that Hazel and Leo had entered was buried under tons of rubble. "We can't go that way," Nico said. "Maybe." Suddenly he staggered. He would have fallen if Jason hadn't caught him. "Nico!" Piper said. "What is it?" "The doors," Nico said. "Something's happened. Percy and Annabeth. We need to go now." "But how?" Jason said. "The tunnel's gone." Frank clenched his jaw. He hadn't come this far to stand around helplessly while his friends were in trouble. "It won't be fun," he said. "But there is another way."